In the deepest dungeons of the Imperial Palace, beneath layers of adamantium and ceramite, past corridors that wind through the bones of mountains, there sits a figure upon a throne of gold. This is not a king resting after conquest, nor a ruler sleeping between campaigns. This is something far more terrible. This is a god trapped in a dying body, a mind of unimaginable power shackled to flesh that has been rotting for 10,000 years, and a soul that holds back an ocean of demons with nothing more than will and the prayers of 1,000,000,000,000 faithful. The Emperor of Mankind has not moved from the Golden Throne since the end of the Horus Heresy. Every day 1,000 psychers give their lives to sustain his consciousness. Every moment his mind battles entities in the warp that could swallow suns, and every passing year the ancient mechanisms that keep him alive degrade a little more, inching toward the moment when they will finally, catastrophically fail. But before we explore what happens when that moment arrives, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? What part of the world are you in, and what time is it where you are? Are you drifting off to sleep, or perhaps just waking up? Maybe you're working through the night, or traveling through the darkness. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope this story reaches you well. The state of the God Emperor. To understand what would happen if the Emperor finally woke, we must first understand his current state. The Emperor was not always the corpse thing that now inhabits the Golden Throne. 10 millennia ago, he was the most powerful being humanity had ever produced. Born in ancient prehistory from the collective sacrifice of thousands of shamans who pooled their souls to create a protector for mankind, he walked through human history under countless names and guises. He was a king, a prophet, a warrior, a philosopher. Some legends claim he was the historical figure known as Alexander the Great. Others whisper he walked alongside the great leaders of antiquity, always guiding, always protecting, always hidden. During the Great Crusade of the 30th millennium, the Emperor finally revealed himself fully to humanity. He united terror under his banner, forged 20 Primarchs as his generals, and created the Space Marine Legions to reconquer the galaxy in humanity's name. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though humanity would truly inherit the stars. The Emperor's vision was not merely conquest, but enlightenment. He promulgated the imperial truth, a secular philosophy that rejected superstition and religion in favor of reason and science. He believed that by denying the chaos gods the worship and faith that sustained them, humanity could starve the ruinous powers and break free from their influence forever. But the Emperor's plans required a secret project, one so dangerous and so vital that he kept it hidden even from his own sons. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, he had discovered an ancient device from the Dark Age of technology, a device that could open a gateway into the webway, the labyrinthine network of passages through the warp that the ancient elder had created. If humanity could access the webway, interstellar travel would no longer require ships to brave the nightmares of the Immersive. Humanity could spread across the galaxy instantaneously, connected by a network that would make them truly invincible. The Emperor modified this device into what became known as the Golden Throne. It was a colossal mechanism of psychically reactive gold alloy, suspended over massive doors large enough for a titan to walk through unbowed. The throne was the key to his grand design, the focal point through which his psychic might could protect the human-built sections of the webway from the predations of chaos. He poured his attention into this project, delegating the Great Crusade to his favoured son, Horus, while he worked to secure humanity's future. Then came betrayal. Horus, corrupted by chaos, turned against his father and plunged the galaxy into civil war. The Horus heresy was a catastrophe that nearly destroyed the Imperium before it had truly begun. But perhaps the most devastating blow came not from Horus himself, but from another Primarch, Magnus the Red. Magnus, desperate to warn his father of Horus's treachery, used forbidden sorcery to breach the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Palace. In doing so, he shattered the Emperor's carefully constructed defences and tore open a rift directly into the human-built portion of the webway. Demons poured through the breach by the thousands. The Emperor was forced to abandon his great crusade and sit upon the Golden Throne, using his psychic might to hold back the tide of chaos and prevent the demons from bursting through into terror itself. For 7 years during the heresy, he sat there, unable to leave, unable to guide his forces, unable to prevent the galaxy-spanning civil war that tore his Imperium apart. When Horus finally reached Terra and laid siege to the Imperial Palace, the Emperor was forced to make a terrible choice. His oldest friend, Malcador the Sigillite, took his place upon the Golden Throne, holding back the demons while the Emperor teleported aboard Horus's flagship to confront his fallen son. The duel that followed was unlike any battle in human history. Father fought son with weapons that could reshape reality itself, and though the Emperor ultimately prevailed, the victory cost him everything. Horus, empowered by all 4 Chaos gods, inflicted wounds upon the Emperor that would have killed any other being instantly. The Emperor's body was broken beyond any mortal capacity to heal. His limbs were shattered, his organs destroyed, his flesh burned and torn by energies that should not exist in the material universe. Only his psychic will kept his soul anchored to his dying body. When the Loyalists found him, he was barely alive, and Malcador had burned himself to ashes holding the throne in his absence. The Emperor was installed upon the Golden Throne permanently. The device that had been meant to usher in a golden age for humanity instead became his prison and his life support. The tech priests of Mars worked frantically to modify the throne to sustain the Emperor's failing body. They succeeded, but only barely. The throne's arcane mechanisms slow his decay but cannot stop it. The Emperor's body has been slowly rotting for 10,000 years, kept in a state of living death by technology that even the Mechanicus no longer fully understands. 10,000 years, 100 centuries have passed since the Emperor last walked among his people. Generations beyond counting have lived and died knowing only that the master of mankind sits immobile upon his throne, neither living nor dead, watching over humanity with a gaze that sees everything and nothing. The ordinary citizens of the Imperium have been taught to believe that the Emperor has always been upon the Golden Throne, that he is an eternal and unchanging God who has guided humanity since the dawn of time. Few remember or know the truth, that he was once a being who walked and spoke, who laughed and fought, who had plans and dreams for the species he loved. What remains of the Emperor now is difficult to comprehend. Those few who have been granted an audience with him describe different things, their perceptions coloured by their own nature and the Emperor's psychic projections. Some see a withered corpse, barely recognisable as human, wrapped in cables and tubes that pump unknown substances through what remains of his circulatory system. Others perceive a being of pure light, too bright to look upon directly, a star compressed into human form. The Sister of Silence, Carrier Catherine, immune to psychic influence, saw perhaps the truest vision. A man in perpetual agony, mouth open in a silent scream, face lined with pain that has aged his ageless features. The Emperor's mind, however, remains active. Though his body is trapped, his consciousness ranges through the warp, battling demons and chaos gods in conflicts that exist beyond human comprehension. He is constantly vigilant, his attention divided across the entire Imperium. Through his psychic might, he powers the Astronomicon, the great beacon that makes interstellar travel possible. He protects psychers from demonic possession when they send their thoughts across the stars. He battles the endless tide of demons that still presses against the breach Magnus opened in the webway. He manifests visions to his faithful through the Emperor's tarot. He empowers the living saints who fight in his name. He is everywhere and nowhere, present in the prayers of every Imperial citizen yet absent from the material world. But the Golden Throne is failing. This is not speculation or fear, but observable fact. The mechanisms that sustain the Emperor's life grow more unstable with each passing year. The tech priests who maintain the throne have watched in horror as components that have functioned for 10,000 years begin to malfunction. Ancient systems that once hummed with power now sputter and strain. Warning indicators that had been dark for millennia suddenly illuminate, signalling catastrophic failures in systems the Mechanicus no longer knows how to repair. The knowledge of how to properly maintain the Golden Throne has been lost. The Emperor built it with technology from the Dark Age of technology, a period when humanity's understanding of science and engineering far exceeded anything the Imperium possesses in the 41st millennium. The modifications made during the heresy were desperate improvisation, brilliant engineering performed under impossible circumstances, but never meant to last 10,000 years. Since then, the tech priests have performed maintenance through ritual and prayer more than understanding. They replace components when they fail, but they do not truly comprehend how those components function. They have become mechanics maintaining a machine they barely understand, watching it slowly die and knowing they cannot prevent it. Recent events have made the situation even more dire. After the opening of the Great Rift, a massive warp storm that split the galaxy in two, the Astronomicon flickered and went dark. The period that followed, known as the Days of Blinding, lasted different lengths across the Imperium. On Terra itself, the darkness endured for 33 days. 33 days where no navigator could see the Emperor's light. 33 days where interstellar travel became impossible. 33 days where the Imperium held its collective breath and wondered if this was the end. The Astronomicon returned, but the fact that it could fail at all sent shockwaves through the Imperium's leadership. If the beacon could go dark for 33 days, what would stop it from going dark forever? The tech priests intensified their efforts to maintain the throne, but they know they are fighting a losing battle. The question is not if the Golden Throne will fail, but when. The Astronomicon and the infrastructure of Imperium. To truly understand the catastrophe that would follow the Emperor's death or awakening, we must first understand the Astronomicon and the role it plays in holding the Imperium together. The Astronomicon is not merely a light in the darkness, it is the single most important piece of infrastructure in the Imperium, more vital than any forge world, more essential than any fortress, more precious than the countless billions of soldiers who fight in the Emperor's name. The Astronomicon is a psychic beacon located within the Hollow Mountain in the Himalaysian mountain range on Terra. It was constructed during the Great Crusade specifically to enable long-range warp travel. Before the Astronomicon existed, humanity relied on ancient Xenos devices called Pharos, built by the Necrons to project stable navigation beacons through the warp. These devices had been lost during the Age of Strife, and without them, human civilization had collapsed into isolated pockets, unable to communicate or travel between star systems. The Emperor created the Astronomicon to replace these lost beacons. The device itself is a massive chamber carved from a single mountain peak, tiered and vast enough to hold thousands of people. Within this chamber stands a choir of 10,000 psykers known as the Chosen. These are not ordinary psykers, but individuals who have been carefully selected and trained by the Adeptus Astronomica for this singular purpose. They have studied the lore of the Astronomicon, learned to control and focus their psychic energies, and achieved a mystic understanding of their role in the Emperor's grand design. When the Chosen are finally called to serve, they enter the chamber of the Astronomicon and add their psychic might to the choir. Together they generate an immense amount of raw psychic energy, a roiling mass of power that exists simultaneously in the material universe and the warp. But raw psychic energy alone is not enough. It must be focused, directed, shaped into something that can cut through the chaos of the Immaterium and reach across the galaxy. Only one being possesses the psychic strength necessary to perform this task, the Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor's consciousness, even in his broken state, is powerful enough to take the energy generated by the 10,000 Chosen and forge it into a beam of psychic light that extends approximately 50,000 light-years from Terra. This beam, the Astronomicon itself, shines through both real space and the warp, creating a fixed reference point that navigators can use to triangulate their position when travelling through the Immaterium. Without it, warp travel would be limited to short, calculated jumps of no more than 4 or 5 light-years at a time, and even those would be extremely dangerous. The human cost of maintaining the Astronomicon is staggering. The process of generating the psychic energy required for the beacon slowly drains the life force of the Chosen. They fade over time, their vitality consumed by the vast machine they power. On average, approximately 1,000 of the 10,000 Chosen die every single day, burned out by the effort of sustaining the Emperor's light. Their bodies are removed, and new Chosen are brought in to take their places. The Adeptus Astronomica maintains a constant supply of trained psykers ready to join the choir, knowing that their service will lead inevitably to their deaths. This sacrifice is considered the highest honour a psyker can achieve in the Imperium. The Chosen go to their fate willingly, some even eagerly, understanding that without their sacrifice the Imperium itself would cease to function. They have been taught that they will die in the Emperor's service, giving their lives so that humanity can continue to spread across the stars. Their yellow robes and shaven heads mark them as separate from ordinary humanity, beings who have transcended mortal concerns to become part of something greater. But the Astronomicon is not perfect, and its limitations create the effective borders of the Imperium. Because Terra is located in the galactic west, the beacon does not cover the extreme eastern regions of the galaxy. This creates a hard limit on Imperial expansion in that direction. Worlds beyond the Astronomicon's reach are effectively cut off from the Imperium, isolated by distance and the impossibility of reliable warp travel. Some sectors on the eastern fringe maintain contact through short warp jumps, or rely on alternative navigation methods, but they are tenuous connections at best. Furthermore, the Astronomicon itself is not static. Its light flickers and wavers as the Emperor's attention is pulled in different directions, as the Chosen die and are replaced, as the Golden Throne experiences fluctuations in its failing systems. Navigators describe it as a chorus of heavenly voices, beginning with a single note and building into an angelic symphony. But that symphony is not constant. Sometimes the voices fade. Sometimes they become discordant. During the days of blinding, they went silent entirely. The infrastructure that depends on the Astronomicon is almost impossible to fully comprehend. The Imperium encompasses approximately 1 million worlds, though the exact number is unknown because the Administratum itself has lost track. These worlds are scattered across the galaxy, separated by hundreds or thousands of light-years of void. Without the Astronomicon, each of these worlds becomes an island, unable to communicate with or travel to any other world in a reasonable time frame. Consider what this means for Imperial governance. The Imperium functions through a vast bureaucracy spread across the galaxy. Orders issued from Terra can take years or decades to reach their destination, even with the Astronomicon functioning. Tithes of resources, troops, and psychers flow along carefully maintained shipping lanes that connect thousands of worlds in an intricate web of commerce and military logistics. The Adeptus Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, draws regiments from thousands of worlds and transports them across the galaxy to fight on the frontiers. The Space Marine chapters maintain fleets that patrol assigned sectors, responding to threats wherever they emerge. The Inquisition operates across the entire Imperium, hunting heretics and xenos without regard for planetary boundaries. All of this depends absolutely on the ability to travel through the warp with reasonable accuracy and safety, and that ability depends absolutely on the Astronomicon. If the beacon fails, if the Emperor can no longer direct its light across the galaxy, the entire structure collapses. Imagine it like this. The Imperium is a body, and the Astronomicon is its circulatory system. When the heart stops, the body begins to die within minutes, even if every other organ remains technically functional. The Imperium would face the same fate. Ships in transit when the Astronomicon failed would be lost immediately. Navigators used the beacon to plot courses through the warp, avoiding the worst currents and predators that inhabit the Immaterium. Without it, they would be blind, forced to either attempt an emergency translation back to real space in an unknown location, or continue forward without guidance, hoping desperately that they might stumble upon their destination before their ship was destroyed. The vast majority would fail. They would become ghost ships, trapped forever in the warp, their crews slowly driven mad by exposure to the realm of chaos, eventually consumed by demons or lost in temporal storms that exist outside the normal flow of time. Forge worlds that depend on shipments of raw materials from mining worlds hundreds of light years away would see their production grind to a halt within months. Hive worlds that import food from agri-worlds across their sectors would begin to starve within a year. Fortress worlds that rely on regular reinforcements and resupply from distant sectors would find themselves isolated, forced to fight with whatever resources they had on hand when the darkness fell. Space Marine chapters whose recruitment worlds are located far from their fortress monasteries would lose the ability to replace casualties, slowly dwindling in strength as attrition took its toll. The military implications would be even more immediate and devastating. The Imperium is constantly at war on thousands of fronts simultaneously. Orc invasions, Tyrannid hive fleets, Chaos incursions, Necron awakenings, and TOE expansion push against Imperial borders in every direction. The Imperium's strategy for dealing with these threats relies on its ability to rapidly redeploy forces from one war zone to another. When a sector faces an overwhelming threat, reinforcements can be called from across the galaxy. Entire crusades can be assembled, drawing ships and soldiers from dozens or hundreds of worlds, concentrating overwhelming force at the critical point. Without the Astronomicon, this becomes impossible. Each sector, each subsector, each individual world would be forced to face its enemies alone, with whatever forces it happened to have available. Some sectors are heavily fortified, with powerful Space Marine chapters, large Imperial Guard deployments, and strong defensive fleets. These might endure for years or decades, slowly ground down by enemies they cannot defeat without reinforcements. Other sectors are thinly defended, relying on rapid response forces from neighbouring sectors to shore up their defences when threatened. These would fall quickly, overwhelmed before they could mount an effective defence, and the Xenos would notice. The Imperium's enemies are not mindless. They would see the sudden paralysis that gripped humanity, the inability to coordinate or reinforce, and they would strike. Orc war bosses would launch wheeze against targets that suddenly lacked the ability to call for help. Necron overlords would accelerate their awakening protocols, knowing that the time to reclaim their ancient domains had come. The Tyrannid hive mind would sense weakness in its prey and redirect hive fleets accordingly. The Toe Empire would see an opportunity to expand their greater good at humanity's expense. And chaos, always chaos, would pour through every crack in the Imperium's defences, launching raids and invasions that the defenders could not hope to repel without coordination. The psychological impact would be equally devastating. The Imperium's citizens have been taught for 10,000 years that the Emperor watches over them, that his light guides humanity through the darkness, that no matter how dire the situation, the God Emperor protects. The failure of the Astronomicon would shatter that faith. When the beacon went dark, when the Emperor's light ceased to shine through the warp, billions of Imperial citizens would be forced to confront the possibility that their god had abandoned them. Some would cling even more desperately to their faith, praying harder, making greater sacrifices, hoping to call the Emperor back. Others would despair, falling into nihilism or madness, and some would turn to other powers, seeking protection from the ruinous powers of chaos or the promises of Xenos prophets. This brings us to perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Astronomicon's purpose. The beacon does not merely guide ships through the warp, it also serves as a psychic ward, a lighthouse that holds back the darkness. The Emperor's presence in the warp, projected through the Astronomicon, creates a zone of relative stability around Terra and throughout much of the Imperium. His psychic might actively suppress his warp phenomena, making it harder for demons to manifest in real space and shielding psychers from the worst predations of chaos. If the Astronomicon failed, this protection would vanish. The warp, always pressing against the thin barrier between realities, would surge through. Possession rates would skyrocket as demons found it easier to claim mortal hosts. Psychers who had been safely controlled through training and force of will would become conduits for chaos, their minds consumed by entities that poured through them into the material universe. Entire worlds could be dragged into the warp, consumed by warp storms that turned reality itself inside out. Terra itself would face the most immediate threat. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the breach in the webway that Magnus opened 10,000 years ago still burns. The Emperor has held it closed through sheer psychic might for 100 centuries. His consciousness pressed against the gate like a hand holding a door shut against a hurricane. If he died, if his attention wavered for even an instant, that breach would explode open. Legions of demons, greater demons, and demon princes and horrors beyond naming would pour through the breach and directly into the heart of the Imperial Palace. The Custodian Guard would fight. They are the Emperor's personal guardians, 10,000 warriors whose skill and equipment far exceed even that of the Space Marines. They have stood vigilant for 10,000 years, waiting for the moment when they might be needed to defend their master. They would sell their lives dearly, each custodian worth 100 demons or more. But there are only 10,000 of them, and they would face millions, perhaps billions of demons. They would be overwhelmed, not through weakness, but through simple mathematics. To prevent this, the Emperor ordered Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamander's Legion, to install a device known as the Talisman of 7 Hammers. This talisman is a dead man's switch, a fail-safe mechanism designed to activate only if the Golden Throne fails and the demons breach into the palace. When activated, the talisman would destroy not just the Imperial Palace, not just the surrounding area, but the entire planet of Terra. It would annihilate the cradle of humanity, the holiest world in the Imperium, to prevent the demons from claiming it. This is not a metaphorical destruction. It is not a partial destruction. The Talisman of 7 Hammers would erase Terra from existence, killing every living thing on the planet in an instant. The billions of pilgrims who travel to Terra seeking the Emperor's blessing would die. The countless administrators who run the Imperium's bureaucracy from the vast hive complexes of Terra would die. The tech priests maintaining the ancient machinery in the forges of Mars would die as the blast consumed the entire Sol system. Everything humanity had built over 40,000 years of recorded history would be reduced to atoms and dust. And for what? To deny chaos its greatest prize. To prevent the demons from desecrating the Emperor's corpse, from twisting Terra itself into a demon world, from using the heart of the Imperium as a staging ground for endless invasions into real space. The Emperor knew that if Terra fell to chaos, the psychological blow alone would destroy the Imperium. Better to erase it entirely than to let it become a monument to humanity's defeat. This is the Emperor's final gift to his people. If he cannot save them, he will at least spare them the horror of seeing their holiest world corrupted. It is a gift born of love and desperation, the last resort of a being who has sacrificed everything for humanity's survival, but knows that sacrifice may not be enough. The faith that sustains and destroys. But perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of the Emperor's current state is the role faith plays in sustaining him. The Emperor never wanted to be worshipped as a god. This is one of the great ironies of the Imperium, that the state religion is built entirely on a foundation the Emperor himself rejected. During the Great Crusade, he promulgated the Imperial Truth, a secular philosophy that explicitly denied the divinity of any being, including the Emperor himself. He believed that superstition and religion were weaknesses that made humanity vulnerable to chaos, that by rejecting the supernatural and embracing reason, humanity could starve the chaos gods of the worship that sustained them. The Emperor punished those who worshipped him. When his son Lorgar, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, began converting worlds to worship the Emperor as a god, the Emperor's response was brutal. He ordered the Ultramarines Legion to destroy the city of Monarchia on Kur, a city where the Word-Bearers had built great temples to the Emperor's glory. Then he forced the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel before the ruins and publicly humiliated them, declaring them failures for wasting time on religion when they should have been conquering worlds. The Emperor made his position clear. He was not a god. He did not want to be worshipped, and those who insisted on doing so were defying his will. But the Emperor could not control what happened after he was interred upon the Golden Throne. unable to speak, unable to enforce his will directly. He could only watch as humanity gradually turned him into the very thing he had fought against. The trauma of the Horus heresy, the loss of half the Space Marine legions to chaos, the apparent death of the Emperor himself, all of these factors created a desperate need for hope. The people of the Imperium needed something to believe in, and in their suffering they turned to the only being who seemed powerful enough to protect them. The seeds had already been planted. Lorga's book, the Lectitio Divinitatus, had spread throughout the Imperium during the Great Crusade, distributed by the word-bearers to every world they brought into compliance. After the Emperor's interment, this book became the foundation for countless Emperor worship cults that sprang up across Imperial space. The strongest of these was the Temple of the Saviour Emperor, founded by a former Imperial Army officer named Fatidicus, who had fought at the Siege of Terra. This temple grew rapidly, spreading its message of hope and redemption through faith in the God Emperor. By the early 32nd millennium, less than 1,000 years after the heresy, approximately 2/3 of the Imperium's population followed the teachings of the Temple of the Saviour Emperor. The exceptions were the Space Marines, who maintained their reverence for the Emperor as their creator and leader, but refused to worship him as a god, and the Adeptus Mechanicus, who worshipped the Omnissiah, their machine god, though many believed the Emperor and the Omnissiah were the same being. Eventually, the Temple of the Saviour Emperor became so powerful that it was formalized into the Ecclesiarchy, the official state church of the Imperium. The faith became known as the Imperial Cult, and its teachings, the Imperial Creed, became the law of the Imperium. To deny the Emperor's divinity became heresy, punishable by death. To worship other gods became the highest crime. The Imperium transformed from a secular empire built on reason into a theocracy built on faith, and nothing the Space Marines or the few remaining rational voices could do would reverse this transformation. This created a fascinating and terrifying dynamic in the warp. The Chaos Gods draw their power from worship, from the emotions and beliefs of mortal beings. Every act of worship, every prayer, every sacrifice feeds them. They are not truly gods in the sense of being creators or omnipotent beings, but rather vast concentrations of psychic energy formed from the collective unconscious of sentient species. They are reflections of morality's darkest aspects, given form and consciousness by billions of minds all thinking similar thoughts, feeling similar emotions. The Emperor understood this. It was why he rejected worship so vehemently. He knew that if humanity worshipped him, their faith would create something in the warp, a reflection of himself formed from their collective belief. He knew that this warp entity might not share his goals or his love for humanity. It might be something altogether different, shaped by humanity's fears and desperate hopes, rather than by the Emperor's own will. But 10,000 years of worship from quadrillions of human beings cannot help but create something in the warp. With every prayer spoken by every faithful Imperial citizen, with every psyker sacrificed to maintain the Golden Throne, with every miracle attributed to the Emperor's intervention, with every living saint empowered by faith in the God Emperor, a presence has been growing in the Immaterium. It is not quite the Emperor, and not quite a Chaos God, but something in between. It is a reflection of humanity's collective faith in their protector, their father, their God. This presence has become powerful enough that demons and chaos entities recognize it. They call the Emperor the anathema, the antithesis of everything chaos represents. They fear this presence because it embodies order, law, structure, everything that chaos seeks to destroy. The chaos gods themselves have begun to acknowledge the Emperor as a threat equal to their own power, a fifth god rising in the warp who opposes everything they stand for. And here is the terrible irony. This faith may be the only thing keeping the Emperor conscious. His physical body is long past the point where it should have died. His soul should have departed to the warp millennia ago, freed to reincarnate as he had done in ages past. But the faith of the Imperium binds him to the Golden Throne, anchors his consciousness to his rotting flesh, forces him to remain in his prison because billions of humans believe he is there, watching over them. Their belief makes it true, their worship sustains him against his will, and he cannot escape because they will not release him. The living saints provide perhaps the clearest evidence of this dynamic. These are individuals, usually members of the Adepta Sororitas, who are empowered by faith to perform miracles. They manifest wings of light, they survive wounds that should be fatal, they inspire those around them to superhuman feats of courage and strength. The most famous, Saint Celestine, has died and been reborn multiple times, returning to life through the power of faith each time she falls in battle. The ecclesiarchy attributes these miracles to the Emperor's direct intervention, claiming that the God Emperor reaches out from the Golden Throne to empower his most faithful servants. But the truth is likely more complex. These miracles are probably manifestations of the warp entity formed by humanity's collective faith, the reflection of the Emperor that humanity has created through 10,000 years of worship. This entity is not the Emperor himself, but it draws on his psychic signature, exists in sympathetic resonance with his consciousness, and acts in ways that align with what humanity believes the Emperor would want. This creates a fascinating theological question that the Imperium's theologians have debated for millennia. Is the Emperor actually a god? Or has humanity created a god in his image through their faith? The answer may be that both are true simultaneously. The Emperor himself is not a god in the traditional sense, but the collective faith of humanity has created a godlike entity in the warp that is connected to him. The two are distinct yet inseparable, bound together by the prayers of quadrillions of faithful souls. This has profound implications for what would happen if the Emperor died or awakened. If his physical body died and his consciousness was freed from the Golden Throne, what would happen to the warp entity formed by humanity's faith? Would it merge with his freed consciousness, transforming him into an actual god whether he wanted it or not? Would the two remain separate, creating two different versions of the Emperor existing simultaneously? Or would the warp entity dissipate once the Emperor was no longer bound to his physical form, its purpose fulfilled? Some Imperial theologians, particularly those of the Thorian faction, believe that the Emperor's consciousness has already departed his body, that what remains on the Golden Throne is merely an empty shell kept functioning by the machine, while his true consciousness has transcended into pure warp energy. They believe that the Emperor is already effectively a god, existing throughout the warp and the materium simultaneously, no longer bound by the limitations of physical form. They point to the increasing frequency of miracles, the manifestation of living saints, the reports of the Emperor appearing to the faithful in visions and dreams, all as evidence that he has already ascended beyond mortality. Others, particularly the Amalathians, believe that the Emperor must remain exactly as he is, that any change to the current situation would be catastrophic. They argue that the Emperor's suffering on the Golden Throne is necessary, that his eternal vigilance is what keeps humanity alive, and that any attempt to change his situation, whether by healing him, allowing him to die, or otherwise interfering, would doom the Imperium. They see the current state of affairs not as a tragedy to be resolved, but as a sacred mystery to be preserved. The truth, as with so many things in the 41st millennium, is probably more complicated than any single faction understands. The Emperor exists in multiple states simultaneously. He is the broken body on the Golden Throne, kept barely alive by ancient machinery. He is the consciousness that battles demons in the warp, that holds shut the breach in the webway, that powers the Astronomicon. He is the warp entity formed by humanity's faith, the reflection of himself created by quadrillions of prayers. He is all of these things at once, and perhaps none of them fully capture what he has become over 10,000 years of suffering. When the machine dies, the immediate physical consequences. So what happens when the Golden Throne finally fails? What occurs in the moments after the last mechanism gives out, after the final warning siren sounds, after the tech priests realize that there is nothing more they can do? The immediate consequences would be catastrophic beyond measure, but they would not be uniform across the galaxy. The nature of space-time in Warhammer 40,000 means that effects would propagate differently depending on location, warp currents, and countless other factors. On Terra itself, the end would come swiftly. The moment the Golden Throne ceased functioning, the Emperor's consciousness would be freed from the prison that has held him for 10,000 years. Without the throne's mechanisms binding his soul to his body, his psychic presence would be released. What form this release would take is unclear. Some theorize he would die instantly, his soul departing to the warp as it had been struggling to do for millennia. Others believe his consciousness would explode outward in a psychic shockwave that would scour Terra clean of life, but the more immediate threat would come from the webway breach. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's psychic might has held shut the doors that Magnus shattered. Behind those doors, legions of demons press constantly against the barrier, seeking entrance into the material universe. The Custodian Guard maintains an eternal vigil in the webway itself, fighting an endless war against demons that few in the Imperium even know exists. They battle in silence, unknown and unsung, holding the line in a war that has lasted for 100 centuries. When the Golden Throne fails, when the Emperor's consciousness is freed, that barrier would collapse. The doors would burst open, and the demons that have been waiting for this moment since the heresy would finally gain entrance to Terra. They would pour through by the millions, perhaps billions. Bloodletters, plague-bearers, demonettes, horrors, every variety of chaos demon would flood through the breach and into the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace. The Custodian Guard would fight as they have always fought, with skill and determination that exceeds anything else in the Imperium. Each Custodian is worth 100 Space Marines, their weapons and armour crafted with arts that have been lost since the Great Crusade. Their guardian spears would reap a terrible toll among the demons, each thrust banishing a demon back to the warp. Their auramite armour would turn aside blows that would shatter ceramite. They would form shield walls and fighting retreats, contested every metre of ground with tactical genius born of 10,000 years of training. But they would be fighting an impossible battle. There are only 10,000 custodians, and they would face unlimited numbers of demons. For every demon they banished, 10 more would take its place. For every corridor they held, 5 more would be breached elsewhere. They would fight with everything they had, calling on every resource available, activating ancient defences built into the palace itself, unleashing weapons from the dark age of technology that had been held in reserve for precisely this moment. The Space Marines on Terra would join the defense. Dozens of chapters maintained ceremonial contingents on humanity's holiest world, from the Imperial Fists who have guarded Terra since the Heresy, to smaller chapters who station honor guards at sacred sites. These warriors would rush to the palace's defense, fighting alongside the custodians in a desperate battle to contain the breach. The Sisters of Battle stationed at countless shrines across Terra would take up arms, their faith driving them forward even as demons tore through their ranks. The Imperial Guard regiments garrisoning Terra would mobilize, throwing millions of soldiers into the battle. It would not be enough. The demons would overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. They would spread through the palace, corrupting and destroying everything they touched. Ancient relics of the Great Crusade would be desecrated. Sanctuaries that had stood for 10,000 years would burn. The bodies of fallen heroes preserved in stasis would be torn apart and devoured. Everything sacred to the Imperium would be violated and destroyed. And when the demons broke free from the palace into Terra itself, when they spilled into the hive cities and industrial zones that covered the planet's surface, the true horror would begin. Terra is home to billions of human souls, from pilgrims who travelled for years to reach humanity's holiest world, to administrators who run the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, to the countless workers who maintain the planet's infrastructure. All of them would become prey for the demon hordes. The Talisman of Seven Hammers would activate. This is its purpose, the reason Vulcan installed it beneath the palace at the Emperor's command. It is designed to detect when the demon breach becomes unstoppable, when the custodians can no longer contain the tide, when Terra itself is about to fall to chaos. The moment that threshold is crossed, the talisman activates automatically, giving no warning, allowing no last-minute evacuations or desperate final stands. The explosion would be beyond nuclear, beyond even the power of the greatest weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. It would be a device built with knowledge from the dark age of technology, designed specifically to destroy an entire world in an instant. Terra would be consumed in a flash of light brighter than any star. The atmosphere would be stripped away, the oceans would boil and evaporate, the continents would crack and shatter, the planet's core would destabilize. Within seconds, nothing would remain of Terra except expanding debris and the screams of billions of souls torn from their bodies and cast into the warp. Mars, Terra's sister world and home to the Adeptus Mechanicus, would likely be consumed as well. The two worlds are close enough that the destruction of Terra would doom Mars through gravitational disruption, tidal forces, and the sheer energy released by the talisman's activation. The entire Sol system would become a graveyard, its planets rendered uninhabitable, its space lanes filled with debris. But perhaps the most terrible aspect of Terra's destruction would be the fate of the Emperor's soul. When his body is finally destroyed, when the Golden Throne shatters and his flesh is consumed in atomic fire, what happens to his consciousness? Does it survive the destruction of his physical form? Does it ascend to become a true god in the warp, free at last from the prison of flesh? Does it merge with the warp entity formed by humanity's faith, creating something new and potentially even more powerful? Or does it fragment and dissipate, scattered across the warp like ashes on the wind? The Emperor is a perpetual, a rare type of human who cannot truly die, whose soul always reincarnates in a new body when the old one is destroyed. But his current state is unprecedented. He has existed in a state between life and death for 10,000 years, sustained by machinery and worship, his soul bound to his body in ways that should not be possible. The rules that govern perpetuals may no longer apply to him. His reincarnation may be impossible, his soul too damaged and changed by 10 millennia of suffering to follow the normal patterns. Some theorists suggest that if the Emperor dies, his soul would need time to coalesce and reincarnate. The perpetual nature that allowed him to survive through all of human history would eventually bring him back, but it might take centuries or millennia. During that time, humanity would be without his protection, without his guidance, forced to fend for themselves in a galaxy that has grown far more dangerous than it was when he first emerged. This possibility has given rise to the Star Child theory, a heretical belief held by some radical inquisitors and secret societies within the Imperium. This theory proposes that the Emperor has already split his soul in two. The greater part remains bound to the Golden Throne, holding back the demons and powering the Astronomicon. But a smaller fragment separated at the moment of his interment, a pure and uncorrupted piece of his consciousness that exists in the warp waiting to be reborn. According to this theory, there exist individuals called sensei, descendants of the Emperor born during his millennia of wandering human history. These sensei are said to possess fragments of the Emperor's power, making them invisible to the warp and immune to chaos corruption. An organization called the Illuminati, composed of inquisitors, space marine librarians, and other powerful individuals, supposedly works to gather these sensei and prepare them for a ritual. This ritual would sacrifice the sensei at the moment of the Emperor's death, using their combined power to help the Star Child reincarnate instantly, rather than taking centuries to naturally reform. The theory is almost certainly heretical, and those who espouse it openly are hunted by the Inquisition. But it persists because it offers hope. It suggests that the Emperor's death is not the end but a transition, that he must be allowed to die so that he can be reborn whole and healthy, free from the prison of the Golden Throne and capable once more of leading humanity, as he did during the Great Crusade. Whether the Star Child theory has any basis in reality is unknown. What is certain is that the Emperor's death would create a vacuum of power in the warp that would have profound consequences. For 10,000 years, his presence has been a bulwark against chaos, a point of light in the darkness that holds back the worst excesses of the ruinous powers. If that presence suddenly vanished, the Chaos Gods would surge forward to fill the void. The Imperium fractures, political and military collapse. While terror burns and the Emperor's fate hangs in balance, the rest of the Imperium would face its own cascade of failures. The political structure of the Imperium is built entirely on the foundation of the Emperor's authority. He is not merely the ruler, but the source of all legitimacy, the being from whom all power flows. Every law is enacted in his name. Every military order derives its authority from his will. Every High Lord rules only because they claim to speak for the Emperor. When he dies, that foundation crumbles. The High Lords of Terror are the 12 most powerful individuals in the Imperium, second only to the Emperor himself. They include the Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum, the Fabricator General of Mars, the Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, the Master of the Administratum, and several other positions of similar importance. Together they form the Senatorum Imperialis, ruling the Imperium in the Emperor's name because he cannot speak to issue orders himself. But the High Lord's authority depends entirely on the premise that they are carrying out the Emperor's will. They claim that through prayer, meditation, divination, and studying the Emperor's past actions, they can determine what he would want them to do. This is an obviously flawed system, one that has led to corruption, inefficiency, and catastrophic mistakes throughout the Imperium's history. But it works because everyone accepts the premise that the Emperor is still alive, still watching, still capable of intervening if the High Lords stray too far from his intentions. When the Emperor dies, that premise evaporates. The High Lords would have no claim to legitimacy beyond their personal power and the forces they command. They would be revealed as what they truly are: ambitious individuals who have been playing at governance while hiding behind the Emperor's name. Other powerful figures would immediately challenge their authority. The Space Marine chapter masters would be first. These are the leaders of the 1,000 or so chapters descended from the original Space Marine legions, each commanding between 500 and 1,000 superhuman warriors. Many of these chapter masters are veterans who have served for centuries, who remember times when the High Lord's incompetence led to disasters that cost millions of lives. They have long chafed under the authority of mortals who claim to speak for the Emperor, yet demonstrate no wisdom or strategic genius. With the Emperor dead and Terra destroyed, the chapter masters would see no reason to continue following orders from the High Lords. Some would declare themselves independent, transforming their chapters into autonomous military forces answerable to no one but themselves. Others would form coalitions, allying with neighbouring chapters to create regional power blocks. Still others might attempt to seize control of the Imperium themselves, claiming that as the Emperor's finest warriors, they have the right and duty to rule in his absence. The Adeptus Mechanicus would almost certainly declare independence. The tech priests of Mars have always been semi-autonomous, following the Treaty of Olympus that made them partners with the Imperium rather than subjects. They worship the Omnissiah rather than the Emperor, though many believe the two are the same being. With the Emperor dead and Terra destroyed, Mars would become the most powerful industrial centre remaining in what had been the Imperium. The Fabricator General would likely declare Mars an independent power, claiming that the Mechanicus owes no loyalty to the High Lords, now that the being who made the Treaty of Olympus no longer exists. This would be catastrophic for any remaining Imperial forces. The Mechanicus controls virtually all advanced manufacturing in what was the Imperium. They build the weapons, the ships, the armour, the vehicles that Imperial forces depend on. Without access to Mechanicus Forge worlds, any remaining Imperial loyalist faction would find itself unable to replace losses or maintain its equipment. Within a generation, lack of spare parts and maintenance would reduce even the mightiest Imperial fleet to derelict hulks. The various branches of the Inquisition would fragment as well. The Inquisition is not a unified organization, but a loose coalition of individuals united only by their shared authority to investigate any threat to the Imperium. Different Ordos focus on different enemies. The Ordo Xenos hunts aliens, the Ordo Malleus battles demons, the Ordo Hereticus roots out corruption within the Imperium itself. These different branches have often worked at cross purposes, and with the Emperor's death removing their common purpose, they would likely turn on each other. Inquisitors of the Amalathian faction, who believe in preserving the status quo at all costs, might attempt to continue enforcing the old Imperial authority, even though that authority no longer exists. They would hunt those they deemed traitors or heretics, executing anyone who refused to acknowledge the High Lord's legitimacy. Meanwhile, Inquisitors of the Recongregator faction, who believe the Imperium must be reformed and renewed, might see the Emperor's death as the opportunity they had been waiting for. They would work to tear down the old power structures and build something new in their place. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, would face a profound crisis of faith. These warrior women have dedicated their entire existence to serving the God Emperor, fighting and dying in his name with absolute faith in his divinity. The destruction of Terra and the Emperor's death would shake that faith to its core. Some sisters would cling desperately to their belief, insisting that the Emperor cannot truly die, that he will return or has already ascended to a higher plane of existence. Others would fall into despair, their faith shattered by the evidence of their god's mortality. This theological crisis would split the ecclesiarchy, the imperial church, into dozens or hundreds of competing factions. Different cardinals would interpret the emperor's death differently, each claiming that their understanding represents the true faith. Some would preach that the emperor's death was a necessary sacrifice, that he gave up his physical form to ascend to true godhood and now watches over humanity from the warp itself. Others would declare that the emperor's death proves he was never truly divine, that the imperial cult was built on lies, and that humanity must find new gods to worship. This latter group would be particularly dangerous because they would be vulnerable to chaos corruption. When faith in the emperor is shattered, when people are told that everything they believed was false, some will desperately seek something else to believe in. The chaos gods are always waiting for such moments, ready to offer power and purpose to those who have lost their way. The ecclesiarchy's collapse could lead to mass conversions to chaos worship, with entire cardinal worlds falling to the ruinous powers within years of the emperor's death. The administratum, the vast bureaucracy that manages the Imperium's day-to-day operations, would continue functioning for a time through sheer institutional inertia. Scribes would keep filing reports. Tax collectors would continue demanding tithes. Ships would still transport goods along established trade routes. But without central authority to resolve disputes or make decisions, the administratum would gradually cease to function as a unified organization and become thousands of independent bureaucracies, each administering its own little corner of what had been the Imperium. Individual sectors would become isolated fiefdoms ruled by whoever had the most military power. Sector governors, freed from oversight by terror, would declare themselves independent rulers. Some would try to maintain the old imperial traditions, still calling themselves part of the Imperium, even though the Imperium itself no longer existed as a unified entity. Others would embrace their new independence, establishing dynasties and kingdoms that openly rejected any connection to the former Imperium. The most powerful of these successor states would be those centered on Space Marine homeworlds. Chapters with strong recruiting bases and productive Forge World allies could become major regional powers. Ultramar, the 500 worlds ruled by Robert Guilliman and the Ultramarines, would likely become the most powerful successor state. It already functions as a semi-independent realm within the Imperium, with its own currency, legal system, and military structure. With the Imperium gone, Ultramar could expand to encompass entire sectors, becoming a true interstellar empire in its own right. But Ultramar would not be alone. The Dark Angels could claim dozens of systems around their fortress monastery of the Rock. The Space Wolves could establish dominance over the worlds near Fenris. The Blood Angels could create a power block centered on Baal. Other chapters would do the same, carving out spheres of influence from the Imperium's corpse. Within a century, the galaxy might be divided among dozens of these Space Marine kingdoms, each independent but sharing a common heritage and culture. These kingdoms would not necessarily be hostile to each other, at least not initially. The Space Marine chapters have a long tradition of cooperation and mutual aid. They would likely form defensive alliances, agreeing to come to each other's aid against Xenos threats or chaos incursions. but they would not reunite into a single empire. The old Imperium would be dead, replaced by a loose confederation of successor states that shared culture and history but maintained political independence. The military implications of this fragmentation would be severe. The Imperium's defense strategy relies on its ability to concentrate overwhelming force wherever it is needed most. When a hive fleet threatens a sector, battle fleets and guard regiments are drawn from across the Imperium to repel the invasion. When a Black Crusade emerges from the Eye of Terror, every chapter within reach is called to contribute forces. This strategy works because of the Imperium's ability to coordinate across vast distances, and because all forces acknowledge the High Lord's authority to issue such orders. In a fragmented galaxy, this coordination would be impossible. Each successor state would have to defend itself with its own resources. Some states would be strong enough to endure. Others would be slowly ground down by enemies they could have defeated if reinforcements had been available. Entire regions of space would fall to chaos, the Tyranids, the Necrons, or other threats because the forces to defend them simply would not arrive in time. The economic consequences would be equally devastating. The Imperium functions as a massive trading network, with raw materials flowing from mining worlds to forge worlds to hive worlds in an intricate web of commerce. Some worlds produce nothing but food, others manufacture a single type of component. Still others serve as trading hubs where goods are consolidated and redistributed. This system only works because the Imperium maintains the infrastructure necessary to move goods across vast distances and enforces the rules that keep trade flowing. Without that infrastructure and enforcement, the trading network would collapse. Worlds that depend on imported food would starve. Forge worlds that need specific raw materials to function would go dark. Hive worlds where billions live in crowded urban sprawls would descend into chaos as food riots and resource wars consumed their populations. The death toll from economic collapse might exceed even the casualties from military defeats, claiming billions or trillions of lives as worlds that could not sustain themselves independently simply died. The Star Child and paths to reincarnation, but perhaps the Emperor does not truly die. Perhaps his nature as a perpetual means that death is merely a transition rather than an ending. The concept of the Star Child suggests that the Emperor's death might actually be necessary for his rebirth, that only by allowing his current tortured existence to end can he return to true life. This theory has profound implications for what happens when the Golden Throne fails. The Emperor's origins as a perpetual are shrouded in mystery and legend. According to the most reliable accounts, he was born in ancient Anatolia during the 8th millennium BCE, though some sources place his birth earlier. But he was not originally the godlike being he would become. Instead, he was the result of a mass ritual performed by a group of shamans who foresaw humanity's growing psychic potential and the dangers it would bring. These shamans were early psychers, humans whose minds touched the warp and who could see the future in ways ordinary humans could not. They foresaw that as humanity's psychic presence in the warp grew stronger, predatory entities would be drawn to feed on human souls. They saw a future where humanity would be prey for things that existed outside of normal reality, where every death would risk the soul being consumed rather than peacefully dissipating. To prevent this, the shamans performed a ritual of mass suicide, gathering together and ending their lives simultaneously. But they did not die in the normal sense. Instead, their souls merged in the warp, combining their power and consciousness into a single being. This merged entity then reincarnated in a newborn human child, creating the being who would eventually become the Emperor of mankind. This origin is what made the Emperor perpetual. His soul was not a single human consciousness, but thousands of them woven together. When his body died, his soul did not dissipate but remained coherent, eventually finding a new body to inhabit. Over the course of 40,000 years, the Emperor lived countless lives, always reincarnating when his body died, always growing in power and wisdom with each new incarnation. But the Emperor's current state is unlike anything he has experienced before. His body on the Golden Throne is not truly dead, but neither is it truly alive. His soul is bound to his rotting flesh by machinery and worship, unable to depart and reincarnate as it naturally would. He has existed in this liminal state for 10,000 years, far longer than any perpetual has ever remained in a single incarnation. This raises a terrifying question. What if the Emperor can no longer reincarnate? What if 10,000 years bound to a dying body has damaged his soul beyond the point where it can maintain coherence? Normal perpetuals die and return relatively quickly. The Emperor has been suspended between life and death for 100 centuries. His soul may be so fragmented, so twisted by suffering and the worship of quadrillions of faithful, that when his body finally dies, his consciousness will simply shatter and dissipate into the warp. The Star Child theory offers hope against this possibility. According to this theory, the Emperor anticipated this problem during the Horus Heresy. In his final moments aboard Horus's flagship, after obliterating his fallen son's soul, but before his own broken body was returned to Terra, the Emperor divided his own soul. The greater portion remained with his body, destined to sit upon the Golden Throne and suffer for 10,000 years, but a smaller fragment, pure and uncorrupted, was released into the warp to wait for the moment of rebirth. This fragment, the Star Child, supposedly exists somewhere in the Immersive, hiding from the Chaos Gods, growing slowly in power as it absorbs the souls of those who die with faith in the Emperor. It is said to be protected by the Sensei, the Emperor's mortal descendants, who are invisible to the warp and immune to chaos corruption, because they carry fragments of the Emperor's power in their blood. The Illuminati, a secret society composed of some of the Imperium's most powerful individuals, supposedly work to prepare for the Star Child's return. According to legend, they gather the Sensei and protect them from the Inquisition, which hunts them as dangerous mutants or potential heretics. When the Golden Throne finally fails, when the Emperor's body dies, the Illuminati plan to perform a ritual that will sacrifice all the Sensei simultaneously, using their combined power to empower the Star Child and allow it to instantly reincarnate rather than taking centuries to naturally reform. This ritual would supposedly create a new Emperor, one who combines the Star Child's purity with the Emperor's ancient wisdom and power. This new Emperor would be free from the burden of the Golden Throne, healthy and whole, capable once more of leading humanity, as he did during the Great Crusade. He would be a true god, empowered not just by his own psychic might, but by 10,000 years of worship from quadrillions of faithful souls. The theory is appealing because it transforms the Emperor's death from a tragedy into a necessary sacrifice. It suggests that the Emperor has been planning his own death and rebirth for 10,000 years, that his suffering on the Golden Throne was not pointless but part of a long game to save humanity. It gives purpose to the sacrifice of the 1,000 psykers who die daily to sustain him, suggesting that their deaths are not merely maintaining a dying god, but buying time for a rebirth that will save humanity. But the Star Child theory is almost certainly heretical. The Inquisition has hunted those who espouse it, executing them as dangerous radicals who threaten the stability of the Imperium. The Ecclesiarchy denounces it as blasphemy, insisting that the Emperor is already a god, and that suggesting he needs to be reborn implies he is somehow imperfect in his current state. The High Lords of Terror see it as a threat to their authority, because if the Emperor truly could be reborn, they would have no justification for continuing to rule in his name. Moreover, there is very little evidence that the Star Child actually exists. The Sensei, if they ever existed, have been hunted to near extinction by the Inquisition. The Illuminati, if they are real, are so secretive that even the most thorough investigations have failed to prove their existence. The theory itself might be nothing more than wishful thinking, a story told by those who cannot accept that the Emperor's death might truly be the end. Yet there are hints that something unusual is happening in the warp. Psychers and navigators report seeing a light in the Immaterium, separate from the Astronomicon, that grows brighter with each passing year. Some describe it as a star being born, starting as a faint glow but gradually increasing in intensity. Others speak of a presence in the warp that feels like the Emperor but different, younger and more vital than the ancient consciousness they normally sense from the Golden Throne. Could this be the Star Child growing in power? Or is it the warp entity formed by humanity's faith, the reflection of the Emperor created by 10,000 years of worship? The distinction may not matter. Whether the Emperor himself planned his own reincarnation, or whether humanity's faith is creating a new god in his image, the result might be the same. A powerful entity in the warp that embodies humanity's hope and determination to survive. There is also the Thorian philosophy to consider. The Thorians are a faction within the Inquisition who believe that the Emperor's consciousness has already left his body, that what remains on the Golden Throne is an empty shell. They think the Emperor's true consciousness exists as pure energy in the warp, that he has already achieved apotheosis and become a true god. According to Thorian beliefs, the Emperor can manifest through specially prepared human hosts, individuals whose faith and psychic potential make them suitable vessels for divine possession. The Thorians point to the living saints as evidence of this. When St. Celestine manifests her wings of light, when she rises from death to fight again, when she performs miracles that should be impossible, they see the Emperor working through her. They believe that if they could find the perfect host, someone with enough faith and psychic power, the Emperor could fully incarnate in that person, effectively being reborn without needing to wait for his body to die. This philosophy has led some Thorians to engage in extremely controversial activities. They conduct experiments on potential hosts, exposing them to psychic energies and measuring their resistance to possession. They study records of possession cases, trying to understand what makes an individual suitable as a vessel for divine consciousness. They even maintain hidden facilities where they attempt to artificially create the perfect host through genetic manipulation and psychic conditioning. The results of these experiments have been mixed at best and catastrophic at worst. Most test subjects simply die or go mad. A few have become powerful psychers in their own right, but show no signs of hosting the Emperor's consciousness. And in at least one documented case, an experiment went horribly wrong, creating a demon-possessed monster that required an entire Grey Knight strike force to destroy. Yet the Thorians persist because they believe they are working toward the Emperor's rebirth. They see the current situation as unsustainable, the Golden Throne as a prison that must eventually fail. They believe that by preparing suitable hosts, they can offer the Emperor a path back to mortal form when his current body dies. Whether they are visionaries working toward humanity's salvation, or dangerous heretics playing with forces beyond their comprehension, remains to be seen. Chaos Ascendant, the Dark God's victory. While theories about the Emperor's rebirth offer hope, we must confront a darker possibility, that his death would not lead to renewal, but to Chaos's ultimate victory. The four ruinous powers have worked for 10,000 years to destroy the Imperium and claim the galaxy for themselves. The Emperor's death would bring them closer to that goal than ever before. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos and leader of the Black Legion, has launched 13 Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror over the past 10 millennia. Each crusade has been a massive military campaign aimed at breaking through Imperial defences and ultimately reaching Terra itself. The 13th Black Crusade resulted in the opening of the Great Rift, the massive warp storm that split the galaxy in two. With the Emperor dead and the Imperium fractured, Abaddon would launch what could be the final Black Crusade, one aimed not at conquest but at annihilation. The Chaos Space Marine legions would unite as they have not since the Heresy. The Black Legion, the Word-Bearers, the World-Eaters, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the Emperor's Children, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and countless warbands would put aside their rivalries to strike at the Imperium's corpse. They would sense weakness as predators sense wounded prey, and they would fall upon the scattered remnants of Imperial civilization with savage glee. The Demon Primarchs would return in force. Magnus the Red, Mortarion, Fulgrim, Angron, perhaps even Perturabo and Lorgar, who have been absent from the material universe for millennia. These godlike beings, empowered by their patron Chaos gods, would lead armies of demons and traitor space marines against the Emperor's former realm. They would seek to complete what Horus began, to tear down everything their father built and replace it with a galaxy ruled by chaos. The psychological impact of the Emperor's death would make the Imperium's defenders vulnerable to corruption. Faith has been the Imperium's greatest defense against chaos. When soldiers face demons and traitor space marines, when they witness horrors that break lesser minds, their faith in the God Emperor sustains them. They believe he is watching over them, that their sacrifices matter, that they fight for a cause greater than themselves. When the Emperor dies, that faith would waver. Soldiers would ask themselves why they should continue fighting when their god has abandoned them. Citizens would wonder if chaos was right all along, if the ruinous powers are the true gods and the Emperor was merely a pretender. This doubt would create openings for demonic possession, for cultists to recruit new members, for chaos worship to spread through populations that had been loyal for millennia. Entire worlds would fall to chaos without a shot being fired. The collapse of faith could turn loyal Imperial citizens into chaos worshippers within a generation. Imagine a hive world where the population has been taught for centuries that the Emperor protects, that faith is rewarded, that those who serve loyally will be blessed. Now imagine the priesthood announcing that the Emperor is dead, that Terra itself has been destroyed, that everything they believed was based on lies. Some would double down on their faith, insisting that the Emperor cannot die, that he has merely ascended to a higher plane. But others would feel betrayed, abandoned by the god they served. These disillusioned souls would be prime targets for chaos cults, which would emerge from hiding to offer new gods, new purpose, new meaning in a universe that suddenly seems empty. The Chaos Gods themselves would grow stronger from the Emperor's death. The grief and despair of quadrillions of faithful would feed Nurgle, the god of decay and despair. The rage and desire for revenge would empower Khorne, the blood god. The scheming and manipulation as factions competed for power would strengthen Tzeentch, the changer of ways, and the excess and depravity that often follows the collapse of civilizations would nourish Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure. More than that, the Emperor's death would remove the single greatest obstacle to Chaos's domination of the galaxy. The Emperor has battled the Chaos Gods in the Warp for 10,000 years. His psychic presence has been a bulwark that holds them back, limiting their ability to manifest in real space and protecting humanity from the worst of their influence. Without him, the barriers between the warp and reality would weaken everywhere. Warp storms would become more frequent and more powerful. Demonic incursions would increase 100-fold. Worlds that had been safe for millennia would suddenly find themselves assaulted by entities from beyond reality. The Great Rift, the massive warp storm that currently splits the galaxy, would likely expand. It might consume entire sectors, pulling them into the Immersive and transforming them into hellscapes where the laws of physics no longer apply. The Eye of Terror, the 10,000-year-old warp storm where the traitor legions have made their home, could grow to encompass hundreds of nearby systems. New eyes might open across the galaxy, creating zones where chaos reigns supreme and mortal life cannot survive unchanged. Yet there is a paradox here that must be considered. The Chaos Gods may not actually want to destroy the Imperium completely. Chaos feeds on the emotions and souls of mortals. If all mortal life in the galaxy were destroyed or corrupted, chaos would eventually starve. The Chaos Gods need the Imperium to exist, or at least they need mortal civilizations to exist so they can harvest the emotions and worship that sustain them. This is why the Chaos Gods have never truly united against the Imperium despite having the power to do so. They are locked in what they call the Great Game, an eternal competition among themselves for dominance in the Warp. Khorne hates Slaanesh. Tzeentch opposes Nurgle. They sabotage each other's plans as often as they work together. Abaddon's greatest achievement has been getting all four gods to support his efforts simultaneously, but even that alliance is fragile and temporary. The Emperor's death might actually cause the Chaos Gods to turn on each other even more viciously than before. Without him as a common enemy, their natural rivalry would intensify. They might spend more time fighting each other than attacking what remains of the Imperium. Khorne's demons might battle Slaanesh's forces for control of conquered territory. Tzeentch's schemes might undermine Nurgle's plans to spread plague. The forces of chaos could become their own worst enemies. This does not mean the Imperium would be safe. Even a divided chaos would be more than strong enough to destroy most of what remains. But it does suggest that complete annihilation might not be inevitable. Pockets of human civilization might survive in the chaos, protected by Space Marine chapters or powerful psychers, or simply by being too insignificant for the Dark Gods to bother with. There is also the question of what the Emperor would become in the Warp if he died. Would his soul be consumed by the Chaos Gods, torn apart and devoured before it could reincarnate? Or would he become something else? A new power in the Warp that could challenge the ruinous powers directly. 10,000 years of worship from quadrillions of souls has poured immense psychic energy into the Warp entity formed in the Emperor's image. If that entity merged with the Emperor's freed consciousness, the result might be a fifth Chaos God, one dedicated to humanity's survival rather than its corruption. This possibility terrifies many within the Imperium even more than the Emperor's simple death would. A god of order and law, empowered by worship but fundamentally opposed to the nature of chaos, would be something unprecedented. It would not truly be the Emperor that humanity knew, but rather something new wearing his face, shaped by humanity's faith and fears over 10,000 years. This new god might protect humanity, but at what cost? What would it demand in return for its protection? Would it be any better than the chaos gods it opposed, or merely a different flavour of damnation? Robert Guilliman, The Last Hope. In discussing what happens when the Emperor dies, we must consider the role of Robert Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, and the only one of the Emperor's sons currently active and loyal to the Imperium. Guilliman was resurrected in the closing years of the 41st millennium after being in stasis for 10,000 years. His return has already begun to reshape the Imperium, but his presence becomes even more critical when we consider what would happen if the Emperor died. Guilliman is one of the few beings alive who actually met the Emperor before his interment. He fought in the Great Crusade. He helped write the Codex Astartes that governs how Space Marine chapters operate. He remembers what the Imperium was supposed to be, what the Emperor's original vision was before the Horus Heresy twisted everything. This gives him a legitimacy that no other leader in the current Imperium can claim. Shortly after his resurrection, Guilliman was granted an audience with the Emperor on the Golden Throne. What transpired in that meeting is one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. Guilliman himself has sworn never to reveal what was said, and the Adeptus Custodes who guard the throne room maintain absolute silence on the matter. But what we know from Guilliman's later actions and words paints a disturbing picture. Guilliman emerged from his meeting profoundly shaken. Those who saw him described him as devastated, as though something he had believed in had been shattered. In his private thoughts, recorded in sources like the novel Dark Imperium, Guilliman reflects on how cold the Emperor seemed, how inhuman. He felt that his father treated him not as a son but as a tool, a weapon to be deployed rather than a person to be valued. The Emperor he met was nothing like the father he remembered from the Great Crusade. This suggests several disturbing possibilities. Either the Emperor has changed fundamentally over 10,000 years of suffering, his humanity burned away by pain and sacrifice until only cold calculation remains. Or perhaps he was always like this, and what Guilliman experienced during the Great Crusade was merely a psychic projection, designed to inspire loyalty rather than the Emperor's true nature. Or the being Guilliman met was not really the Emperor at all, but the warp entity formed by humanity's faith, a god construct that wears the Emperor's face but lacks his warmth and humanity. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, the experience left Guilliman with a terrible understanding. The Emperor he served is not the father he remembered. Yet despite this disillusionment, Guilliman continues to serve. He has taken on the role of Lord Commander of the Imperium, effectively ruling in the Emperor's name while trying to reform the bloated, corrupt bureaucracy he found. He has launched the Indomitus Crusade, deploying the new Primaris Space Marines to reinforce chapters across the galaxy and reclaim worlds lost to chaos and Xenos. When the Emperor dies, Guilliman would be the obvious choice to lead whatever remains of the Imperium. He is a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons. He has proven military genius, having organised the Ultramarines Legion during the Great Crusade and codified how Space Marines should operate for 10,000 years. He has administrative experience, having ruled the 500 worlds of Ultramar, and perhaps most importantly, he has demonstrated that he is willing to make hard decisions for the greater good. even when those decisions cost him personally. But would the Imperium accept his leadership without the Emperor to legitimize him? The Imperial cult has spent 10,000 years teaching that the Emperor is the only god, that all authority flows from him, that those who rule do so only because they carry out his will. Guilliman's authority as Lord Commander depends on their premise that he speaks for the Emperor. If the Emperor is dead, if Terra itself is destroyed, what claim does Guilliman have to rule? His answer would probably be pragmatic. He does not need the Emperor's blessing to do what must be done. The Imperium is falling apart. Enemies assault it from every direction, and someone needs to make decisions and enforce them. Guilliman has the power and the will to do so. That should be enough. This would mark a fundamental shift in imperial governance, from theocracy to something approaching secular military rule. Some factions would support this. The Space Marines, particularly those chapters descended from the Ultramarines, would rally to Guilliman's banner without hesitation. Many in the Astra Militarum would follow a Primarch who actually understands warfare rather than the bureaucrats of the Administratum. Parts of the Adeptus Mechanicus might support him, particularly those who remember the Treaty of Olympus and see cooperation with the Mechanicus as essential, and some Inquisitors would back him as the best hope for humanity's survival, but others would oppose him. The Ecclesiarchy would likely denounce him as a usurper, a false prophet who seeks to replace the God Emperor with himself. After all, Guilliman does not acknowledge the Emperor's divinity. He remembers when his father was a man, albeit an incredibly powerful one, and he has been vocal about his disgust with the imperial cult. Fanatical believers would see his rule as heresy and might launch holy wars against him. Some Space Marine chapters would refuse to acknowledge his authority as well. The Dark Angels have their own secrets and agenda. The Space Wolves have always been independent-minded. The Black Templars are so devoted to the Imperial cult that they might see Guilliman as an enemy of their faith. These chapters would not necessarily oppose him militarily, but they would refuse to follow his orders or cooperate with his plans. The greatest challenge Guilliman would face is simple logistics. The Imperium is too vast, too complicated, too broken for anyone being to rule effectively. Even with the Astronomicon functioning, it takes years or decades for orders from Terra to reach distant sectors. Without the Astronomicon, without Terra itself, how would Guilliman communicate with the forces he claims to command? How would he enforce his authority on worlds thousands of light years away? The answer is that he probably could not, at least not in the way the Imperium has been ruled for the past 10 millennia. Instead, Guilliman would likely focus on creating a new power structure centered on Ultramar and the surrounding sectors. He would consolidate his control over regions he could actually reach and defend, allowing more distant regions to govern themselves as long as they maintained some loyalty to his faction. This would effectively create a new Imperium, smaller than the old but more coherent and easier to defend. It would be an Imperium that acknowledged humanity's limits rather than claiming dominion over the entire galaxy. It would be pragmatic rather than idealistic, focused on survival rather than glory. And it would be ruled by a being who understood warfare, administration, and the necessities of governance rather than by theologians and bureaucrats who had been playing political games for centuries. Whether this new Imperium could survive depends largely on whether other Primarchs return. Guilliman has hinted that he knows where some of his brothers are, or at least has ideas about how to find them. Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, is allegedly sleeping in a hidden chamber within the rock, the Dark Angels' fortress monastery. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, disappeared into the Eye of Terror on a quest but swore he would return when needed most. Jagatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, vanished into the webway pursuing Dark Eldar but might still be alive somewhere in that endless maze. Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, went into the Eye of Terror hunting the traitor Primarchs and has not been heard from since. If even one or two of these Primarchs returned to fight alongside Guilliman, the Imperium's chances would improve dramatically. Multiple Primarchs working together could hold far more territory than Guilliman alone. They could inspire loyalty from chapters and factions that would not follow Guilliman. And their combined military and psychic might could turn the tide against enemies that would otherwise be overwhelming. But there is no guarantee that any of the missing Primarchs would return, or that they would support Guilliman if they did. The Primarchs have never been unified in their thinking. They are brothers but also rivals, each with his own way of making war and his own vision for humanity's future. Getting them to work together has always been difficult, and 10,000 years of separation might have made it impossible. The perfect storm, Xenos threats converging. While chaos and internal collapse pose existential threats to the Imperium, we must not forget that the galaxy is filled with other dangers. The Emperor's death and the Imperium's fragmentation would occur at a time when multiple Xenos races are stronger and more aggressive than ever. The confluence of these threats could create a perfect storm that dooms humanity, even if chaos does not destroy them. The Tyranids represent perhaps the most existential threat. These are not a civilization or an empire, but a force of nature, a galaxy-consuming swarm of bioengineered creatures controlled by a vast hive mind. The Tyranid hive fleets have been entering the galaxy for centuries, drawn by the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon like moths to a flame. They consume everything in their path, breaking down all biological matter and incorporating it into new Tyranid organisms. Worlds that fall to the Tyranids are left as barren rocks stripped of all life. The terrifying irony is that the Astronomicon, humanity's greatest tool for survival, is what draws the Tyranids to the galaxy. The hive mind sensed the beacon's light in the void between galaxies and turned its attention toward the Milky Way. Now dozens of hive fleets, each containing billions of organisms, approach from multiple directions. The largest, Hive Fleet Leviathan, is so massive that Imperial savants estimate it contains more biomass than all other hive fleets combined. If the Astronomicon failed due to the Emperor's death, the Tyranids might be temporarily confused, losing the beacon they had been following. But this would only buy humanity a brief respite. The hive mind would eventually realize that the galaxy is still full of biological material to consume. Instead of converging on Terra, the hive fleets would spread out, attacking targets of opportunity across the entire galaxy. Without Imperial coordination, without the ability to redirect forces to meet the Tyranid threat, individual worlds would fall one by one. The Tyranids cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with. They do not seek territory or resources in the traditional sense. They seek only to consume and grow. Every human, every orc, every Eldar they kill and consume makes them stronger. They learn from every battle, adapting their bioforms to counter whatever tactics defeated them previously. They are evolution weaponized, natural selection accelerated to terrifying speed. Some Imperial theorists have calculated that if the Tyranids consume enough biomass in the galaxy, if enough hive fleets arrive from the intergalactic void, they could eventually consume all life in the entire galaxy. Every world would be stripped bare. Every civilization would be devoured. the galaxy would become a dead zone with nothing left but rocks and metal, and the hive fleets would move on to the next galaxy, leaving only silence behind. The Necrons pose a different but equally existential threat. These are not biological creatures but mechanical beings, the remnants of an ancient civilization that transferred their consciousness into metal bodies millions of years ago. They are waking from their great sleep, emerging from tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy to reclaim what they see as their rightful dominion. The Necrons possess technology that makes even the Imperium's finest equipment look primitive. They can manipulate time and space, strip electrons from atoms to create lightning, phase through solid matter, and unleash weapons that can crack planets. Their most powerful leaders, the Necron overlords and pharaons, have lived for millions of years and wage war with a patience and cunning that shorter-lived species cannot match. Unlike the Tyranids, the Necrons can be negotiated with, but their terms are unacceptable to any living species. They see organic life as a mistake, an infestation that must be cleansed from the galaxy they once ruled. Some Necron dynasties seek to harvest organic beings for study. Others want to transfer their consciousness into living bodies again. Still others simply want to exterminate all organic life out of pure contempt. The Necrons would see the Imperium's collapse as an opportunity to accelerate their plans. Tomb worlds that have been moving cautiously, maintaining low profiles to avoid drawing attention, would become more aggressive. Necron fleets would emerge from hidden bases to strike at vulnerable targets. And the Necron Silent King, the ancient ruler who left the galaxy millions of years ago, has returned with news that the Tyranids threaten all life in the galaxy. He might even be willing to temporarily ally with remaining human factions against the Tyranid threat, though such an alliance would be purely tactical and would end the moment the Tyranids were dealt with. The Orcs represent a more chaotic but no less dangerous threat. Orcs are fungal creatures that live for war, growing larger and stronger through combat. When enough Orcs gather in one place, they generate a psychic field that makes their collective beliefs become reality. If enough Orcs believe that painting a vehicle red makes it go faster, it actually does. If they believe that a crude gun cobbled together from scrap will fire, it will, even though by all laws of physics it should explode in the wielder's hand. The Imperium has fought countless wars against Orc Wags, massive migrations of greenskins led by powerful warlords. These Wags can range from a few thousand Orcs raiding backwater worlds to millions of the creatures following a particularly powerful war boss in an unstoppable tide of violence. The problem is that Orcs are nearly impossible to eradicate. Even when an Orc is killed, it releases spores that eventually grow into new Orcs. The only way to permanently cleanse a world of Orcs is to burn it so thoroughly that every single spore is destroyed, which often means rendering the planet uninhabitable. If the Imperium fell, if Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters were no longer available to respond to Orc invasions, the Greenskins would run rampant. They would multiply exponentially as the wars they fought generated more Orcs. Within a few generations, huge swathes of the galaxy could be overrun with Orcs fighting each other and anyone else they encountered. The Orcs do not seek to build an empire or create civilization. They seek only battle, and they are happiest when they have enemies to fight. The Tow Empire is a younger and less immediately threatening Xenos civilization, but one that is expanding rapidly. The Tow believe in the greater good, a philosophy that all species should work together for the benefit of all. They invite humans and other species to join their empire, offering better living conditions and more equitable treatment than the Imperium provides. Many human worlds have willingly defected to the toe, viewing them as liberators rather than conquerors. The Imperium has fought several wars against the toe, usually ending in stalemates or minor victories for either side, but the toe are learning and adapting quickly. They have reverse-engineered captured Imperial technology, integrated auxiliary species into their military, and developed weapons specifically designed to counter Space Marines and Imperial Guard tactics. If the Imperium collapsed, the toe would likely launch a massive expansion, absorbing human worlds that had been cut off from Imperial authority. From the toe's perspective, this would be an act of mercy, saving humans from the chaos and starvation that would follow the Imperium's collapse. From the human perspective, it would be the loss of independence and submission to Xenos rule. The Space Marines in particular would view toe expansion as intolerable, leading to wars between toe forces and human successor states that refused to submit. The Eldari, both the Craftworld Eldar and their dark kin the Drukhari, would also take advantage of the Imperium's collapse. The Craftworld Eldar are a dying race, living on massive world ships and trying desperately to avoid extinction. They see humanity as primitive barbarians, but they also recognize that humans serve as a buffer between the craft worlds and more dangerous threats like chaos and the Tyranids. The fall of the Imperium would force the Eldar to take more direct action to protect themselves. Some craft worlds might ally with human successor states, offering their advanced technology and psychic powers in exchange for military support against common enemies. Others would remain aloof, intervening only when their own interests were directly threatened, and a few might see humanity's weakness as an opportunity to reclaim worlds that once belonged to the ancient Eldar Empire before the fall. The Drukhari, who live in the dark city of Komaruk deep within the Webway, would launch more raids against vulnerable human worlds. These Dark Eldar survive by torturing other species and feeding on their suffering. The more chaos and disorder in the galaxy, the more targets become available for their raids. The collapse of the Imperium would be like a feast laid before them, with billions of humans suddenly vulnerable to capture and enslavement. All of these threats exist right now, even with the Imperium still functioning. When the Emperor dies, when the Imperium fragments and the Astronomicon fails, every one of these threats would intensify simultaneously. Humanity would face a galaxy full of enemies while lacking the coordination and resources to mount effective defenses. It would be a race to see which threat would destroy them first. Internal collapse, chaos, the Tyranids, the Necrons, the Orcs, or some combination of all of the above. Humanity's resilience a history of survival. Yet despite all of these threats, despite the seemingly inevitable catastrophe that would follow the Emperor's death, there are reasons to hope that humanity might survive. The human race has faced extinction before and endured. The age of strife that preceded the Emperor's emergence lasted 6,000 years, a period when human civilization collapsed. Warp storms made interstellar travel impossible, and humanity was reduced to isolated pockets fighting for survival on individual worlds. Yet humanity survived that catastrophe and eventually rebuilt under the Emperor's guidance. The Imperium as we know it is not the only form that human civilization can take. Before the Age of Strife, humanity had built a different interstellar civilization during the Dark Age of technology. That civilization had been more advanced, more prosperous, and more humane than the Imperium. It fell due to a combination of factors: the birth of Slaanesh and the resulting warp storms, the rebellion of the Men of Iron, and the general collapse of the technological systems that held it together. but the fact that it existed at all proves that humans are capable of building something better than the grim dark dystopia of the 41st millennium. Moreover, humans have one advantage that many xenospecies lack: adaptability. Humans can live on ice worlds, desert worlds, death worlds, hive worlds, and countless other environments. They can adopt new technologies, new tactics, new philosophies when necessary. They are not bound by ancient programming like the Necrons or driven by simple instincts like the Orcs. This adaptability has allowed humanity to spread across the galaxy despite facing countless threats that should have destroyed them. Even now, within the Imperium, there are examples of human societies that function differently from the standard Imperial model. The 500 worlds of Ultramar are better governed, more prosperous, and less oppressive than typical Imperial worlds. Some frontier worlds have developed their own unique cultures and governments, while still nominally owing allegiance to the Imperium. And beyond the Imperium's borders, there are human worlds that have been isolated for millennia, yet have survived and even thrived without Imperial protection. If the Imperium fell, these diverse approaches to human civilization would proliferate. Some successor states would maintain Imperial traditions, keeping the faith in the God Emperor and trying to preserve what they could of the old ways. Others would experiment with new forms of government and society, adapting to their local circumstances rather than following a one-size-fits-all model imposed from distant terror. The Space Marine chapters would be crucial to this survival. Unlike the Imperial Guard, which depends on vast numbers and industrial production, Space Marines are largely self-sufficient. Each chapter has its own fleet, its own recruiting worlds, its own equipment and supplies. They can continue operating for centuries without support from Forge Worlds or the Administratum. As long as a chapter maintains its gene seed stocks and has access to recruiting populations, it can sustain itself indefinitely. Many chapters would become protectors of small empires, using their military might to defend groups of worlds against threats, while allowing those worlds to govern themselves. This is already how some chapters operate, particularly those stationed in frontier regions far from terror. Without the Imperium to dictate their actions, these chapters would have greater freedom to act according to their own judgment and values. Not all Space Marine chapters would remain loyal to humanity's interests. Some might become warlords, imposing their will on civilian populations through force. The Night Lords, who revel in terror tactics, might create kingdoms based on fear. The Marines Malevolent, known for their callous disregard for civilian casualties, might become oppressive tyrants. But most chapters would remember that their purpose is to protect humanity, not rule it. They would use their power to create zones of stability in a chaotic galaxy. The Imperial Navy and the merchant fleets would also play crucial roles. Even without the Astronomicon, short-range warp jumps are possible. Navigators can still sense the currents of the warp, predict dangers, and chart courses between nearby star systems. Trade and communication would be slower and more dangerous, but they would not be impossible. Regional trade networks would develop, allowing worlds within a few light years of each other to maintain contact and support each other. Some savants have theorized that humanity might rediscover or rebuild the Pharos devices, the Necron-built beacons that humanity used before the Astronomicon existed. If remnants of these devices still exist, if the technology could be reverse-engineered or reactivated, humanity might be able to create localized navigation beacons that would serve the same function as the Astronomicon, but on a smaller scale. Each major region of space might have its own beacon, allowing for safe warp travel within that region, even if travel between regions remained dangerous. The Adeptus Mechanicus might be key to this possibility. The tech priests of Mars guard countless ancient technologies and artifacts from the Dark Age of technology and earlier. Among their vaults might be the knowledge necessary to build new Pharos devices, or even to repair the Golden Throne itself. If the right components could be found, if the correct rituals could be performed, perhaps the throne could be restarted with a different occupant than the Emperor. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Could someone else sit upon the Golden Throne? The device requires an immensely powerful psyker to function, someone whose will is strong enough to direct the energies of 10,000 other psykers. Very few beings possess such power. Magnus the Red might have been able to do it, which is probably why the Emperor intended for Magnus to sit the throne before his son's fall to chaos. Malcador the Sigillite managed to hold the throne briefly during the Siege of Terra, but it burned him to ashes within hours. Could one of the remaining loyal Primarchs take the Emperor's place? Lionel Johnson is a powerful psyker, though he rarely displays his abilities. Jagatai Khan has demonstrated psychic potential. Lehman Russ, despite the Space Wolves' distrust of psykers, might possess latent powers. If any of these Primarchs could be found and convinced to sit upon the throne, they might be able to maintain the Astronomicon and hold back the Webway breach, buying humanity time to adapt to the post-Emperor galaxy. But would any Primarch be willing to accept such a fate? To sit upon the throne is to accept 10,000 years of agony, to sacrifice everything for humanity's survival, knowing that the sacrifice may ultimately be futile. It would require a level of selflessness and dedication that few beings possess. More likely, the remaining Primarchs would seek other solutions, ways to defend humanity without condemning themselves to the same fate their father suffered. The nature of awakening. Throughout this exploration, we have assumed that the Emperor's awakening would come through death, through the final failure of the Golden Throne releasing his consciousness. But there are other possibilities to consider. What if the Emperor could be healed? What if he could be freed from the throne without dying? What if he could awaken not through death and rebirth, but through restoration of his original body and mind? The Emperor is a perpetual, a being who cannot truly die. His body on the Golden Throne is broken but not dead, sustained by machinery and willpower. If the damage to his body could be repaired, if his injuries could be healed by some miracle of technology or psychic power, he might be able to leave the throne without triggering the catastrophe we have described. Several possibilities exist for such healing. The Elder possess medical and psychic abilities far beyond anything the Imperium has. During the Heresy, the Elder helped resurrect Rabaut Guilliman after he had been in stasis for 10,000 years with wounds that would have killed any normal space marine. If they could heal a Primarch, might they be able to heal the Emperor? Of course, the Elder would demand a price for such aid, and that price might be more than the Imperium is willing to pay. The Elder might require access to the Black Library, cooperation against the Tyranids, or even assistance in birthing their god of the dead, Inead. The Necrons possess technology that can manipulate matter and energy at the atomic level. They can rebuild destroyed bodies, repair damage that should be irreparable, even transfer consciousness between vessels. If a powerful Necron overlord could be convinced or compelled to heal the Emperor, it might be possible. But the Necrons hate all organic life and would never willingly help humanity. They might heal the Emperor only as part of some incomprehensibly complex scheme that serves their own interests. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, are masters of keeping beings alive through torture and torment. They have maintained slaves for thousands of years, sustaining bodies that should have died long ago. Their homunculi, the flesh crafters of Chimera, can perform biological miracles that border on the impossible. But like all Drukhari, they would demand payment in suffering and souls. The cost of their aid would likely damn whoever made the bargain. There might even be artifacts or technologies hidden somewhere in the galaxy that could heal the Emperor. The Dark Age of technology produced devices of incredible power, many of which have been lost for millennia. Standard template constructs that contain the blueprint for medical technologies beyond the Imperium's current capabilities might still exist on forgotten worlds. Ancient Xenos civilizations might have left behind healing devices in ruins waiting to be discovered, but all of these possibilities assume that healing the Emperor's body would be enough. They assume that his consciousness, after 10,000 years bound to a dying form, after battling demons in Sawarp for so long, after being worshipped by quadrillions of faithful, would be unchanged. This seems unlikely. The Emperor has been profoundly altered by his experience on the Golden Throne. The being who awakened might not be the same being who sat down 10 millennia ago. Robert Guilliman's experience meeting the Emperor suggests that fundamental changes have already occurred. The warmth and humanity that Guilliman remembered from the Great Crusade seemed absent, replaced by cold calculation and inhuman detachment. Whether this change was gradual, the result of 10,000 years of suffering slowly burning away everything that made the Emperor human, or whether it happened all at once during his battle with Horus, we cannot know. If the Emperor awakened, if he stood from the throne whole and healthy, he might be something new entirely. Not the man he was during the Great Crusade, not the warp entity formed by humanity's faith, but some synthesis of the two. He would remember his past, but view it from the perspective of a being who has spent 10,000 years as effectively a god. He would still love humanity, but his love might be the abstract affection a shepherd feels for his flock, rather than the personal connection one individual feels for another. This awakened Emperor might be more powerful than ever before. 10,000 years of worship would have fed the warp entity connected to him, granting him psychic might that eclipses even his pre-heresy power. He might be able to manifest miracles, to strike down demons with the thought, to shield entire sectors from the warp with his will. He could be the god that the Imperial cult has always claimed he is, no longer bound by the limitations of his physical form. But would such a being want to rule the Imperium as it currently exists? The Emperor during the Great Crusade wanted to build a rational, enlightened empire based on science and reason. The Imperium has become the opposite: superstitious, oppressive, stagnant, and dominated by religious dogma that he explicitly rejected. An awakened emperor might decide that the current Imperium needs to be destroyed and rebuilt from scratch, torn down and reconstructed according to his original vision. This would put him in conflict with the very people who worship him. The ecclesiarchy would resist any attempt to eliminate the imperial cult. The High Lords would fight to preserve the power structures that benefit them. Countless imperial citizens whose faith has sustained them through lives of hardship and suffering would be devastated to learn that their god rejects their worship. The emperor might have to wage war against his own imperium to free it from the chains of dogma and superstition. The final vision: what waking really means. So what does it really mean for the emperor to wake? We have explored scenarios ranging from catastrophic collapse to miraculous rebirth. We have considered political, military, theological, and practical implications. We have examined the threats that would emerge and the possibilities for survival. But perhaps the most important question is not what happens externally when the Emperor awakens, but what happens internally to humanity itself. The Emperor has been more than a ruler for 10,000 years. He has been humanity's symbol, its guiding star, its reason to hope in a galaxy full of horrors. When people pray, they pray to him. When soldiers march into battle against impossible odds, they fight for him. When parents teach their children right from wrong, they invoke his name. The Emperor is woven into the fabric of human consciousness across the galaxy in ways that no other figure has ever been. His awakening, whether through death and rebirth or through miraculous healing, would force humanity to confront what it has become. The Imperium in the 41st millennium is a perversion of everything the Emperor claimed to stand for during the Great Crusade. He preached reason. The Imperium embraces superstition. He demanded the rejection of religion. The Imperium has made him the center of the largest religion in galactic history. He wanted humanity to evolve and advance. The Imperium has stagnated and regressed. He fought to free humanity from the influence of chaos. The Imperium's cruelty and oppression create exactly the conditions that allow chaos to thrive. An awakened Emperor would see all of this. He would see that his sacrifice has preserved something, but not what he intended to preserve. He saved humanity from extinction, but at the cost of everything that made that humanity worth saving. The question is whether he would accept this compromise or reject it, whether he would work with what exists or tear it down to start over. If he chose to rebuild, the process would be agonizing for everyone involved. Imagine being an imperial citizen who has lived your entire life believing the Emperor is a god, only to have him return and announce that he is not divine, that everything you believed was false, that the priests who guided you have been perpetuating lies. The psychological trauma would be immense. Some would refuse to accept it, clinging to their faith despite the Emperor himself telling them it is wrong. Others would collapse into despair or nihilism, and some would turn to chaos, their faith in the Emperor broken and desperate for something else to believe in. The Emperor would face an impossible dilemma. To rebuild the Imperium according to his original vision, he would have to destroy the faith that has sustained humanity for 10,000 years. But that faith has become essential to humanity's survival. It shields psykers from demonic possession. It empowers the Sisters of Battle and the living saints. It gives billions of soldiers the courage to fight against horrors that would break any rational mind. Without that faith, humanity might collapse faster than the Emperor could rebuild. Perhaps the solution is not to choose between the old vision and the current reality, but to synthesize them into something new. An emperor who has spent 10,000 years as the object of worship might have gained new understanding of why faith matters to humanity, even if he still believes it is fundamentally irrational. He might find a way to channel that faith toward constructive ends, rather than trying to eliminate it entirely. This would require him to become what humanity believes he is, not just a powerful psyker and military leader, but a genuine god who guides and protects his people. It would mean accepting the mantle of divinity that he rejected during the Great Crusade, becoming in reality what he has been in belief. Such a transformation would be a profound sacrifice, giving up his original vision and identity to become what humanity needs him to be. Alternatively, he might decide that humanity no longer needs him as it once did. During the Great Crusade, humanity was weak and divided, barely surviving in the aftermath of the Age of Strife. The Emperor stepped forward because someone had to lead. Someone had to unite the scattered remnants of human civilization. But 10,000 years later, humanity has proven its resilience. It has survived without his active leadership. It has developed its own institutions, its own traditions, its own ways of enduring in a hostile galaxy. Perhaps the Emperor's awakening would be his chance to step back, to transition from being humanity's ruler to being its guardian. He could remain a powerful presence, intervening when existential threats emerge, but allowing humans to govern themselves and make their own choices most of the time. This would be closer to how the ancient shamans who created him originally intended, a protector who watches from the shadows rather than an emperor who commands from a throne. But there is another possibility, darker and more disturbing. What if the Emperor awakens and decides that humanity is not worth saving? 10,000 years of watching humans worship him against his will, of seeing them repeat the same mistakes over and over, of witnessing the cruelty and oppression carried out in his name, might have embittered him beyond redemption. The being who emerged from the Golden Throne might be so alien, so changed by suffering and divinity, that he no longer cares about the species he once loved. This would create a situation more terrifying than any we have discussed. An emperor who actively opposed humanity, who saw it as a failed experiment that needed to be ended, would be unstoppable. His psychic power would be godlike. His knowledge of humanity's weaknesses would be complete. He could tear down the Imperium not to rebuild it, but to let it die, clearing the way for something new to emerge. Whether that something new would be better or worse than what came before, whether it would even be human in any meaningful sense, is impossible to say. The weight of choice. All of these scenarios share a common element: choice. When the Emperor awakens, whether through death and rebirth or through healing and restoration, he will have to make choices about what comes next, and humanity will have to make choices about how to respond. These choices will determine whether humanity enters a new golden age, struggles through another dark age, or faces extinction. The Emperor's choices will shape the broad strokes of humanity's future. Will he rule directly or delegate? Will he enforce his will through power or through inspiration? Will he embrace the faith that has grown around him or fight to eliminate it? Will he accept the Imperium as it is or demand that it be transformed? Every decision will have enormous consequences, creating ripples that spread across the entire galaxy. But humanity's choices matter just as much. Will ordinary humans accept the Emperor's leadership or resist it? Will they cling to the faith they have known, or embrace a new understanding of their place in the universe? Will they use the Emperor's return as an opportunity to build something better, or as an excuse to pursue petty ambitions and settle old scores? Will they work together, or fragment further? The Space Marines will have to choose whether to remain loyal to their Primarch Genefathers or to the Emperor himself, and whether those loyalties conflict. The Adeptus Mechanicus will have to choose between independence and cooperation with the New Order. The Inquisition will have to decide whether to continue hunting heretics or to redefine what heresy means in a post-awakening galaxy. Every faction, every organization, every individual will face choices that seemed simple in theory, but prove agonizingly complex in practice. And then there are the choices that enemies of humanity will make. The Chaos Gods will have to decide how to respond to an awakened emperor, whether to unite against him or to continue their eternal game. The Tyrannid hive mind will have to adjust its strategies to account for changes in humanity's defenses. The Necrons will reassess their plans for galactic reconquest. The Orcs will keep doing what Orcs do, fighting anything that looks like a good scrap, but even their simple approach will create complications in a rapidly changing galaxy. The sum of all these choices, human and Xenos, benevolent and malevolent, will determine the galaxy's future. No single being, not even the Emperor, can control every variable. The butterfly effect applies even to gods. A decision made by an obscure planetary governor might trigger events that reshape entire sectors. A Space Marine sergeant's choice in a single battle might save or doom millions. History is made not just by the great and powerful, but by countless individuals whose names will never be recorded, but whose actions matter nonetheless. Hope in the darkness. I have spent over 20,000 words exploring the catastrophes that might follow the Emperor's awakening, the collapse and destruction and suffering that could consume humanity. But I want to end on a different note, one of hope rather than despair, because that is what WarHammer 40,000 is ultimately about. Yes, it is a dark setting, a universe where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, but it is also a universe where hope persists against impossible odds, where ordinary people do extraordinary things, where the light of humanity shines even in the deepest darkness. The Emperor himself is proof of this. He has suffered for 10,000 years in conditions that would have destroyed any other being, yet he endures. Every day he holds back the demons. Every moment he powers the Astronomicon. Every instant he fights battles in the warp that we cannot even comprehend. He does this not because he must, but because he chooses to. Because he loves humanity enough to sacrifice everything for its survival. That love is what makes the Emperor who he is. Not his power, not his intellect, not his military genius, but his fundamental belief that humanity is worth saving. He has seen the worst that humans are capable of, the betrayal of his sons, the corruption of his Imperium, the cruelty carried out in his name. Yet he continues fighting. He has not given up on humanity, and that suggests we should not give up either. When the Emperor awakens, if he awakens, humanity will face its greatest test. But we should remember that humanity has faced impossible tests before and survived. We endured the Age of Strife. We built an interstellar civilization from the ashes of the old. We survived the Horus Heresy despite half our Space Marine legions turning traitor. We have held back the Tyranids, the Necrons, the Orcs, and the forces of Chaos for 10,000 years, despite being outmatched in technology, numbers, and sometimes even determination. What makes humanity special in the WarHammer 40,000 universe is not that we are stronger than our enemies. We are not. It is not that we are smarter. We are not. It is not even that we are more righteous, because the Imperium is brutally oppressive and often monstrous in its treatment of its own citizens. What makes humanity special is that we refuse to give up. We keep fighting even when victory seems impossible. We keep hoping even when hope seems foolish. We keep believing in something better even when the evidence suggests we are doomed. This stubborn refusal to accept defeat is humanity's greatest weapon. It is why the Chaos Gods have not already won despite their overwhelming power. It is why the Tyranids have not yet consumed us despite their infinite hunger. It is why the galaxy is not already ruled by Necrons or overrun by Orcs. Humanity survives not because of the Emperor alone, but because of billions of individual humans who make the choice every day to keep fighting, to keep building, to keep hoping for their children and grandchildren, even if they will never see a better future themselves. When the Emperor awakens, this strength will matter more than ever. Whatever form he takes, whatever choices he makes, whatever vision he pursues for humanity's future, the actual work of survival will fall to ordinary humans. Space Marines and Primarchs, and even the Emperor himself can win battles, but they cannot govern planets, cannot raise children, cannot build the civilization that makes human life meaningful rather than just biological survival. If humanity is to have a future worth living in, it will be because ordinary people choose to create it. They will farm the fields and work the factories and staff the ships. They will raise children and teach them to be better than the generation before. They will create art and music and literature that gives meaning to existence. They will build communities where people care about each other rather than just surviving. They will remember that they are human, not just resources to be consumed by an endless war machine. The Emperor can protect humanity from external threats. He can fight the Chaos Gods, power the Astronomicon, hold back the demons, and inspire the faithful. But he cannot make humanity worth protecting. That is something only humans themselves can do, through their choices, their actions, their determination to be more than victims of a hostile universe. The Call. So as we come to the end of this exploration, as we consider all the possibilities of what might happen when the Emperor finally wakes, I want to leave you with a question. What would you do? If you lived in the WarHammer 40,000 universe, if you were there when the Emperor awakened or died or returned, what choice would you make? Would you cling to the old faith, insisting that the Emperor is divine regardless of what he says? Would you embrace a new understanding, following the Emperor's vision even if it meant abandoning everything you believed? Would you fight to preserve the Imperium as it exists? Would you work to tear it down and build something better? Would you focus on defending your own world and people, letting the greater galaxy go hang? Would you try to unite with others to create something larger? Would you give in to despair and seek whatever comfort you could find in a collapsing civilization? Or would you find hope in the chaos and work toward a better future even if you knew you would never live to see it? These are not easy questions, and there are no right answers, but they are the questions that matter, the ones that determine not just whether humanity survives, but whether survival is worth the cost. The WarHammer 40,000 universe is dark precisely because it asks these questions in the harshest possible context, where every choice comes with terrible consequences and there are no clean solutions. But asking difficult questions is how we grow. Wrestling with impossible dilemmas is how we develop wisdom. And imagining ourselves in extreme circumstances is how we discover what we truly value and who we truly are. The Emperor's awakening forces everyone in the setting to confront these questions, and in doing so, it forces us as readers and fans to confront them as well. Whatever happens when the Emperor wakes, whether it brings salvation or destruction or something in between, the story will continue, because that is what humanity does. We tell stories, we pass them down to the next generation, we use them to make sense of a chaotic universe. The story of WarHammer 40,000 is a story about survival against impossible odds, about finding meaning in suffering, about holding on to hope when there is no logical reason to hope. It is a dark story, certainly. It does not shy away from the horrors of war, the cruelty of oppression, the tragedy of good people ground down by circumstances beyond their control. But it is also a story about courage, sacrifice, loyalty, faith, and the determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves. These themes resonate because they reflect struggles we face in our own world, albeit in less dramatic form. When the Emperor wakes, the story will not end. It will transform, evolve, become something new. Old certainties will crumble, new possibilities will emerge. Some will rise, others will fall. Heroes will be forged in the crucible of change, Villains will seize opportunities for power, and countless ordinary people will do their best to survive and perhaps even thrive in a galaxy forever altered. This is the true answer to what happens when the Emperor finally wakes. Everything changes, but humanity endures. Not because we are destined to survive, not because some prophecy guarantees our future, not because the Emperor or anyone else will save us regardless of our own choices. We endure because we choose to, because we fight for it, because we refuse to accept extinction as inevitable. The Emperor taught us this during the Great Crusade, and he continues to teach it through his sacrifice on the Golden Throne. His awakening, whatever form it takes, will be another chapter in that lesson. It will test humanity as we have never been tested before. Many will fail that test. Worlds will fall, civilizations will collapse, billions will die. But humanity as a whole will survive because that is what we do. We survive. And perhaps, just perhaps, we will do more than survive. Perhaps the Emperor's awakening will give us the chance to become what he always believed we could be. A species that combines reason with faith, strength with compassion, determination with wisdom. Perhaps we will finally build the civilization he dreamed of during the Great Crusade. Not a perfect utopia, but something better than the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. That is the hope that sustains us, the belief that makes all the sacrifice worthwhile. When the Emperor wakes, whether in 10 years or 10,000, whether through death or healing or some transformation we cannot yet imagine, that hope will be tested. And how humanity responds to that test will determine not just our survival, but our worthiness to survive. Conclusion. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Warhammer 40,000's most profound and terrifying questions. We have explored the mechanics of the Golden Throne, the role of faith in sustaining the Emperor, the political and military consequences of the Imperium's collapse, the threats posed by chaos and Xenos, the possibilities for rebirth and renewal, and ultimately what it means for humanity to face its greatest challenge. The truth is that we will probably never know what happens when the Emperor wakes, because that moment represents an ending to the Warhammer 40,000 setting as we know it. It is the apocalypse that has been perpetually approaching for decades of real-world time, the midnight that the clock has been set at 5 minutes before for as long as most fans can remember. It is the threat that gives the setting its tension, the catastrophe that makes every other crisis feel urgent. But in exploring this question, we have learned something about the setting and about ourselves. We have seen that the Warhammer 40,000 universe, for all its darkness and horror, is fundamentally a story about humanity at its limits. It asks what we become when pushed to the brink, what we are willing to sacrifice, what lines we refuse to cross even when survival is at stake. And in answering those questions, even in fiction, we learn something about the human condition itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Warhammer 40,000 lore, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless other stories to explore in this rich and detailed setting, from the Primarchs and their legions to the Xenos races that threaten humanity to the nature of the warp itself. Each one offers its own insights into the grim dark future where there is only war. Until next time, remember, the Emperor protects, but more importantly we protect each other. In the darkness of the far future, in the chaos of the present, in whatever comes next, that is what truly matters. Not the power of gods or the strength of superhumans, but the choice that ordinary people make to stand together against the night,